Now, two very stimulating and very different presentations, and now we will turn to our discussants, and the first is Harry Harding. Harry.
Dan, you want to do this? Thank you very much, Dan, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I congratulate USC on the creation of its China Institute. I wish it every success. We're engaged once again in one of our regular conversations or debates about China and our policy towards China. I think this is very healthy because, among other things, it reflects the fact that we are beginning to end our exclusive preoccupation with the so-called global war on terror and are beginning to address some other equally important long-term issues. And the two papers that we've just heard by June and by Bill together give us great insight into the debate that is beginning to reemerge in the United States, not coincidentally as we begin to approach another presidential election year. June's paper basically outlines what I call the major dimensions of the debate. And Bill's paper provides an explanation of some of the key reasons why it's occurring. I want to supplement what they've said on those two issues, but also say a little bit about the policy choices that the debate is beginning to raise. And I have to say that neither of the paper really fully provides an account of the policy implications of the concerns, the analytic concerns that they have very properly raised. June Dreyer's paper gives us a sense of the unease and disappointment that surrounds much discussion of China today. It's never clear reading June's paper who she is talking about because she writes it in the third person. She says critics say, skeptics charge, and it's not clear the extent to which June agrees with the views that she is citing, and it really doesn't matter whether she does or not. It's very easy to summarize those views, and I'll do so in the following way. China has not become democratic, despite 25 years of economic reform, nor, despite some confident predictions, has it collapsed politically or economically. It continues, despite massive internal problems, to grow in its power on all three dimensions: military, economic, and soft power. But as China becomes a major power, it does not necessarily accept American leadership in key international institutions or key international norms. China is modernizing its armed forces, although it faces no discrete threats that would justify that. It engages in unfair trade practices, import barriers, export subsidies, violations of intellectual property rights, and an undervalued currency. Its leaders say that they want peace, but they don't necessarily mean it. And therefore, American policy is not necessarily on the right track. We try to engage with China, but we end up, as June says, talking past each other, without solving the problems in our relationship. So there's something wrong. There is a sense of unease, a sense of disappointment, of discomfort, both with China and with our policy toward China. Now, why is this? I think Bill Overholt's paper is extremely useful because it traces this sense of unease as much to ourselves as to developments in China, because he tells us that our understanding of that country is based too much on myths and too little on realities. And if your knowledge is based on myths, you are almost always going eventually to be disappointed and be frustrated. Bill does a very good job in identifying the myths. I don't agree with every word of what he said, but I agree with an awful lot of it. But let me, in my commentary, try to go one level deeper than that and to indicate some of the reasons why these myths develop and why they persist, because this is also part of the ongoing debate and discussion about China and U.S.-China policy today. There is a tendency in many quarters, and has been for as long as I've been studying China, I believe as long as Americans have come into interaction with China. There's been a long-standing tendency to portray China in absolute black and white terms, often adding to that a highly moralistic tone. So China is not only either doing well or doing poorly, but it is doing evilly or doing virtuously. In reality, China is an extraordinarily complicated country. And I often say that there is virtually no meaningful and important statement that could be said about China that doesn't have a but or on the other hand in it somewhere. As Bill says, there's both good news and bad news about China. As June cites a senior Chinese diplomat, Xia Zhukang, China is neither heaven nor hell. And yet we try to force it into black and white categories, extreme categories all too often. Relatedly, we view China with a sense of false certainty. We know where China is going. China is going to collapse. China is going to become democratic. There's going to be a war between China and the United States. China will become a pure competitor. It will be the next superpower. June's very excellent summary of the unease is filled with adverbs like inexorably and inevitably. Having worked for a political risk consulting firm, I can tell you that if the world were that predictable, we wouldn't be in business. Our business is based on uncertainty. And China is extremely uncertain, and to treat it as if its future is known and that things are going to inevitably, inexorably, predictably going to happen is simply a misunderstanding. Now, why is this? This is where I want to go one level even deeper. One of the elements in the current debate about China is that China specialists are to blame because we collectively are in the pockets of multinational corporations or manipulated by the Chinese. I don't want to get into that except to say nonsense. And one of the real problems is the debate about China is not dominated by China specialists. Most of the people who are quoted are not China specialists at all. They're business leaders, they're political leaders, they're commentators, they're public intellectuals. So I don't think the problem is necessarily lying in the China specialists. Rather, I would point you to an excellent book by Philip Tetlock called Expert Political Judgment, which is one of the few works of scholarship that tries to say who is right and who is wrong in making predictions. And Tetlock, a professor at Berkeley, argues that there are two kinds of scholarship, hedgehogs and foxes. Hedgehogs know one big thing. Foxes know lots of little things. They both make predictions. Hedgehogs are wrong 90% of the time. Foxes are more right than they are wrong. But hedgehogs get the attention because they're always so clear and convincing. They're the ones who know that China's going to collapse, or China's not going to collapse, or China's going to become democratic or remain authoritarian. And hedgehogs have a huge advantage in public debate because they have utter certainty and clarity about where the world is going. And that is as much a problem of the media as it is the multinational corporations or the Chinese government. In addition, let me say two more things that I think the problems are, and here's where USC can really help. One is the lack of disciplinary depth in our study of China. We simply need to be better informed by people in the relevant disciplines, economics, political science, agriculture, public health, in our discussion about China. As Bill has pointed out, our analysis of trade is woefully uninformed by experts on trade theory. Our discussion of whether China's holding of US treasuries, whether that gives them leverage, is woefully uninformed by input from people who really know how that process works. So we need greater disciplinary depth of the sort that a university can best provide. We also need, and here Bill had some excellent slides comparing China and India, a much better comparative perspective. Because all too often we compare China with ourselves or with itself only and not put it in a comparative perspective. Let me give you one example. As I finish up my time, I won't be able to get to the policy implications either. Maybe we'll do that in the final panel, so I'll have a second chance. A very interesting report came out yesterday from the Pew process, the Pew Public Opinion Surveys, about views of the American role in the world. And just as an example, let me cite some data to show you how the kind of perspective that we sometimes have and the one that I wish we had. Is China opposing the American leadership role in the world? Well, if you look at these figures, it absolutely is. Only 9% of Chinese in this 15-nation survey believe that as the sole remaining superpower, the United States should continue to be the preeminent world leader in solving international problems. Only 9% of Chinese accept continued American leadership in the world. But if you look at the poll a little more deeply, and ask the opposite question. How many people say the U.S. should withdraw from most efforts to solve international problems? 14% of Chinese say we should withdraw. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 other countries of the 15 have larger percentages than China, saying the United States should withdraw. These include American allies like Mexico, France, the Philippines, and Thailand, as well as Peru, Argentina, Russia, Armenia, Ukraine, and Palestine. And in fact, if we go back to the 9%, there's another country where support for the American dominant role is about the same as China, 10% compared to China's 9% within statistical error. That country is the United States. So the American public and the Chinese public actually agree on what the American role should be. And this is a very different view from the idea that the Americans want this and the Chinese want something absolutely opposite. You have to actually look at data, and you actually have to do it comparatively, and you come up with a totally different conclusion than much of what we talk about in the media. What's interesting about this debate, one last word about policy without getting into the details, is how few alternatives are presented. There's a lot of hand-wringing about this isn't working. Engagement, integration, it isn't working. And so we have to do X. But what is the X? There's very little clear alternative. I think the consensus is we have to make this policy work better. And I have some thoughts on that, which I'll probably share with you, if you're interested, get you to stay through tomorrow noontime, because if I have a chance, I'll talk about it then. But what's fascinating about the debate is what I call a hand-wringing debate. It isn't working, but no clear alternative. If anything, there is a sense we should have done things differently in the past, shouldn't have given China most favored nation status, shouldn't have let them into the WTO, shouldn't have done this, shouldn't have done that, but we've done it. And now what do? Well, gosh, we're not sure. Because China's complex, we're frustrated, but we don't have a sense of clear alternatives. Stay tuned.
Thank you, Harry.